Okay, we're ready? So the last thing we spoke about was what happened by the Alter Rebbe when he left the jail. There's one more thing that I'd like to mention that happened before that. And it looks like this happened the last 24 hours that he was in the jail. And that is that the Alter Rebbe was visited by the Chassidus and the Baal Shem Tov. Although both of them were no longer here physically, this is way after they both passed. But as we know, that tzaddikim do have the opportunity to meet with tzaddikim who lived in previous generations. And that's what happened here. The Chassidus Rabbi and the Baal Shem Tov both came to the Alter Rebbe in his prison cell. You got the message that I sent you last night? The message I sent you last night, the names? Is there? Okay. Thank you. You can make a copy, send it to me, a picture, send it to me. So the Baal Shem Tov and the Chassidus Rabbi, when they were by the Alter Rebbe, he said to them, why is this happening to me? Why am I suffering like this? And they said to the Alter Rebbe, because you are revealing Chassidus to an extent and to a degree which is unprecedented. In other words, even more than the Baal Shem Tov, even more than the Magid Mezritch. And in heaven, in Shemayim, there is a argument against you, and you're prosecuting angels against you, that you're revealing secrets of Torah that are meant to be hidden. So the Alter Rebbe said, so if that's the case, once I'm free, should I go back to just giving over Chassidus in a more simple way? And they answered him, no, on the contrary. Once you go out, now that you've gone through this process, you should continue to do what you're doing and even more. In other words, this was the mission of the Alter Rebbe, to reveal Chassidus in a way that's more than all the other masters of Chassidus were doing. And that's what Chabad is, to explain Chassidus in a way that could be understood, just like Gemara, like Halacha. That's something we can digest intellectually. But there was an opposition, and there was something blocking, and you had to break through it. Now that you broke through it, and you had your mysterious nefesh, so go ahead, and you have the green light to go ahead and do that. Which means, we'll explain this more a little bit later, that not only was it that the Russian government, the Tsar and his government gave the Alter Rebbe the green light that he can go ahead and spread Chassidus, it's the other way around. The reason why the Russian government down here gave the Alter Rebbe the green light, because the heavenly court up there gave the Alter Rebbe the green light and said that it could be done. And that we actually see, if you compare the writings of the Alter Rebbe before he was arrested to the writings of the Alter Rebbe after he was arrested, you can't compare it. Before he was arrested, when he would say a Maimah Chassidus, the Maimah was a few lines long. After that, Maimarim are pages and pages, because he began to explain and elaborate more than he ever did before. So by Chassidim, there's actually a term that they use when they repeat something from the Alter Rebbe or a story. Many times the question would be, is this before Petersburg or after Petersburg? Because before Petersburg, things were done in one way. After Petersburg, things were done another way. And it was, if we have time today, or maybe after Shabbos, we'll go to explain what exactly was this controversy about. I'm not talking about the controversy with people who misunderstood, but the real controversy, which is going on in the heavenly court, why there were heavenly reasons not to do it, and why there were heavenly reasons yes to do it. But the Rebbe points out something very interesting. Because this idea that we find tzaddikim communicate with tzaddikim of a previous generation is very common. We find it in Gemara. We certainly find it in stories of great tzaddikim. We find it in the Zohar. But the question is, in what way did they communicate? Was it some sort of a vision in a dream? Or that they actually came back sort of in a physical way, the way they were during their lifetime? For example, when we talk about the Baal Shem Tov, that he studied for 10 years with Achi Ashileni. We spoke about this in the beginning of the year. Achi Ashileni was a Navi. He was the Rebbe, the teacher of Eliyahu Navi. He lived in the times, which was a few years after David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech. And this Achi Ashileni, he was the one who taught the Baal Shem Tov 10 years, Chassidus. Every day they would learn for 10 years. And then the Baal Shem Tov began to teach it to the rest of the world. But when he learned with him for 10 years, it wasn't a vision. He actually was a physical person that came to him. They had a spot, a cave in the mountain where they would sit and learn every single day. And that's how they communicated. So what happened here? The Rebbe tells a story that the previous Rebbe once visited the jail in Petersburg. What is it called? And how do you say it in Russian? No, Petra. Yeah, you see, I couldn't say that. My tongue was twisted in and out right now. So it's a fortress, it's on an island. And apparently after a while, it became like a museum. People went there to look at it. So the Frierdiker Rebbe came back home and told his father that I saw the jail. And I think I was in the cell where the Alter Rebbe was sitting. So the Rebbe Rashab said to the previous Rebbe, is there room there for 3 people? If there's not room for 3 people, then that's not the room where he was. Why? Because it says here that the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid came to the Alter Rebbe, so there had to be room at least for 3 people. And we see from this, the Rebbe says that when they came to the Alter Rebbe, it wasn't in a dream, it wasn't in some sort of a vision, but they came there physically, occupying physical space, and that's why it had to be a room that occupies 3 people. So, going back to the story that the Alter Rebbe, when he went out of jail, the guards led him into the home of the person who was actually an opponent to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe suffered there for 3 hours. And there's a story behind this story. And the story is connected to the printing of Tanya. So initially, when did Tanya begin? When was the beginning of Tanya? So there were 3 stages to Tanya. One stage was when the Alter Rebbe said it orally. In other words, just like a Rebbe would speak and say a mimer, the Alter Rebbe, this was a Hasidic discourse that he gave over. And he gave it over a period of many weeks. And altogether, it was these 53 chapters of Tanya. When did it start? It started the night after the Tzemach Tzedek was born. Tzemach Tzedek was born on an Erev Rosh Hashanah. And that night, Rosh Hashanah, the Maimer, the Alter Rebbe said, was the first 3 chapters of Tanya. And then the week after, he said the other chapters. And the week after, the other chapters, until he finished all 53 chapters. That was stage 1. Stage 2 was the Alter Rebbe wrote it up. That was another level where he put it down in writing. In those days, if you remember when we gave out the booklet, I showed you a page, how they had the Chassidus in those days. It was written, and they made copies of the written. And then came the 3rd stage where it was printed, the way we have it now. But that wasn't so simple. The Alter Rebbe did not want to print it. And he didn't want to print it for reasons known to him, but it could also be that being that there's the whole idea that Chassidus is being revealed in the first place is something unprecedented, something that was being challenged as we see. But when you take something like Chassidus, not only you speak about it, but you put it into printing, which means now it's accessible to everybody and anybody, that's even more of a sort of a risky thing. And he didn't want to do it. What led him to do it at the end? They started to find that there were copies of Tanya circulating, but the words of the Alter Rebbe, there were mistakes in the words, and the mistakes that were written were such mistakes that actually turned around and changed the meaning of Tanya from something positive to something negative. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that if you take an aleph or a beis or a gimel, or sometimes eravav, or take off a letter, a little thing like that could change the meaning of a sentence, and it could turn it around from one way to the opposite. Oh, so that was the question. How did the mistakes happen? One possibility is when you write something and you rewrite, it's natural that mistakes would come about. But when they saw that the mistakes had a message which turned around and it changed, distorted the meaning of the Alter Rebbe's words from something positive, something negative. I'll give you an example. I think this came up in the other class, but the Gemara says this is an interesting thing in Gemara. But the Gemara says the difference between building worlds and destroying worlds could be a dot. What does that mean? There's a pasuk in Chumash, which you probably heard before. It goes like this: Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Okay. So Echad is spelled like this: Aleph, Ches, Dalet. Right? This word, this pasuk declares the oneness of Hashem. People gave up their lives with these words on their mouth. There's another pasuk in Chumash: Lo tishtachave, do not bow down, l'keil acher, to a foreign god. How do you spell acher? Aleph, Ches, Reish. How similar do they look? So the Gemara says, if this says in the Gemara, if a fly would come and sit down on one of the letters, and the ink gets attached to the letters, and then this and sits down right over here, and you get a little black spot here, and it would say, "Do not bow down, la'keil echad," means don't bow down to Hashem. Or if this would be erased, and it would say, "Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Acher Chas v'Shalom." So the Gemara says, this little dot, these are the words of the Gemara, either Machrib or Ilvis could destroy worlds or build worlds. So certainly if you change around the letter, or you add a letter, or you take away a letter, it could sometimes change the meaning from positive to negative. So this, after seeing it so many times, they began to suspect that these mistakes were not natural mistakes, they were intentional distortions. So one time something happened which proved it 100%, and that was the two Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe. One of them, his name was Rav Pinchas Reizes. The other one was Rabbi Yamin Kletzker, two brother-in-laws. Both of them were one of the biggest Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe. They knew Tanya inside out, and they were also businessmen. So they went to a business fair to buy and sell merchandise, and they saw someone selling copies of Tanya. Now, you're probably aware that Chabad Chassidim, the Alter Rebbe, come from Lithuania. So therefore, Chabad Chassidim also speak, the Yiddish is like Lithuanian Yiddish. The way of dress is similar more to Lithuanian than other Chassidim. So basically, you couldn't tell the difference if this person is a Chassid or is a Lithuanian Jew, which at that time, that was the biggest, strongest opposition against Chassidus. It was coming from Lithuania. So they were happy to see that somebody's selling copies of Tanya in this central place. It'll spread Chassidus. And they bought a copy. They started reading it, and they saw that this has some of those mistakes. And they started to talk to him, pretending that they are one of the Lithuanian Jews, not Chassidim. What is this about? And what is the Tanya, this and that? And then he says to them quietly that, we put in a few things here that really are bombs. They're going to show that the Alter Rebbe is unfortunately, Chas v'Shalom, a heretic, and his words are heresy. And I have 600 copies of that I'm going to spread out. When they heard that, it was clear now that these mistakes are being put in intentionally. So they said to this person, "Listen, we are seasoned businessmen. We know our way around here. You're a young man. We'll buy the 600 copies from you, and we'll get it places that you'll never get it there. Sell us all the 600 copies, and we'll get it around." He was very excited. He doesn't have to stand there and sell it. These people will get it around for him, and he sold them all the copies that he had. Naturally, they took the copies, and they did not give it to anybody, but they brought it back to the Alter Rebbe and said to the Alter Rebbe, "Look what's happening. We heard it from his mouth that they intentionally are distorting it, and therefore the only solution we can see is if it's printed. Something's printed, you can't change words. And that's when the Alter Rebbe finally agreed to have it printed. But he agreed on one condition. The condition was that there are two students of the Magid, or two great tzaddikim. One was named Reb Zusha, and one was Reb Yehuda Leib. He said, if these two students will also agree that I should print it, I'll have their consent, and I'm ready to do it. So he sent a delegation of Chassidim to a city called Anapol, and these two tzaddikim lived there, and he gave them the manuscripts of the Tanya. They should study it, and they should give their opinion whether it should be printed or not be printed. So one lived on one end of the town, one lived at the other end of the town, and they say that there's actually a little river or a stream that runs through the middle of the town. So there's a small bridge. So Reb Zusha was sitting in his house, and after reading the Alter Rebbe's writings, he was like jumping out of his skin from excitement. And he ran to share it with the other tzaddik, Rabbi Yehuda Leib. Rabbi Yehuda Leib was reading it in his house, and he was jumping out of his skin with excitement. So he ran to Reb Zusha to share it with him. And they met on the bridge. And it was the middle of the night. They both started dancing and singing. They were so excited with what's written in Tanya. And more people came out. And it was a whole celebration there in the middle of the night. Of course, they gave their haskama. In fact, their consent is printed in the Tanya, and it was incorporated in the Chitas. When the Frierdiker Rebbe set up the study of Chitas, even though it's not Tanya, it's only consent for Tanya, it's part of what we learn when we learn Tanya. It's right in the first pages, the consent of these two tzaddikim. And then the Alter Rebbe said, and when did they give this consent? They gave it in the month of El. The Alter Rebbe said, I would like it to be printed and ready, that people should study in it by Yutes Kislev. Yutes Kislev is the yard site, the day of passing of my Rebbe, the Mezritcha Magid. So I want people to start studying it on that day of Yutes Kislev. And the Alter Rebbe kept rushing, is it ready, is it ready? Think of it, it's less than 3 months. And the machinery in those days was not like today. The communication was not like today. Transportation was not like today. And there was very little time. Don't forget the whole month of Tishrei, you can't do much because there's Yontif. Here it's Rosh Hashanah, here it's Yom Kippur, here it's Sukkot, here it's Simchas Torah. But nevertheless, Alter Rebbe insisted it should be ready on Yutes Kislev. So they rushed and they rushed and they rushed and they rushed their kishkis out. But it wasn't ready on Yutes Kislev. It was ready on Chav Kislev. 1 day later. They brought it to the Alter Rebbe on Chav Kislev, the first copies. The Alter Rebbe was very broken. The Chassidim couldn't understand. And they showed the Alter Rebbe the copies. And the Alter Rebbe looked at it and said, Rabbis machshavis belevish, pasuk, which means there are many thoughts in the mind of a person. Atzas Hashem, he's sakum. But what Hashem wants, that is the way it's going to be. I wanted this to be ready for Yutes Kislev. But apparently Hashem wanted it to be ready today. And he said 3 times, he sighed very deeply and said 3 times, Chav Kislev, Chav Kislev, Chav Kislev. And everybody was like, this is a mystery. Like, what is the big deal if it was ready the next day? Later, when this incident happened, this is what the Chassidim said, and I think it's also repeated in the Sichos of the Rabbeim, that had the Tanya been finished by Yutes Kislev, the Alter Rebbe would not have to have gone through the suffering of Chav Kislev. At the end, we have 2 days Yontif, Yutes and Chav. But the suffering the Alter Rebbe had, which he said was worse to him than the 53 days in jail, it wouldn't have happened had the Tanya been ready on time.
So, unless it was printed before he was in prison?
2 years before, yeah. In fact, this is one of the reasons that led to the arrest, because once the Tanya was printed and it began to be spread out, thousands of people became Chassidim from the Tanya. And that's why they felt very threatened that the Chassidic movement is just growing out of proportion and they must do something to stop it. In 1980 something, I don't remember what year it was, 85, 86, the Rebbe was at the Ohel. And it happened numerous times. He came back from the Ohel and he asked something to be done immediately. And he came back and he said that when the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, it was written in 2 editions. The first edition And then a second edition where he changed things and improved things. That was the final edition. So of course we're learning in the final edition, but we also have the manuscripts of the first edition. And the Rebbe said he wants the first edition printed, should be ready by Yutas Kislev. When was this? In the beginning of Kislev, like 2-3 weeks left. And this is going through a book of Tanya. So the guys who work on this literally did not leave their offices except for Shabbos. They were there day and night, hardly slept. But one of my brother-in-laws was working on this. So I know firsthand, they did not come home. They literally were working on this day and night to have it ready by Yutas Kislev. And the day of Yutas Kislev, they presented the Rebbe with the Tanya. And the Rebbe was very pleased. And the Rebbe said, by the Farbrengen publicly, I never heard the Rebbe say it before. The Rebbe usually doesn't speak this way, but at this time, of course, he thanked all the people that worked on it. And he thanked the wives for allowing the husbands to be away almost 3 weeks from the house to work on this. But then the Rebbe said that the fact that this was ready by Yutas Kislev, this was a tikkun, this was something which corrected whatever damage was done by the fact that the Tanya initially was not ready on Yutas Kislev. So this is the story behind Chav Kislev. So when the Alter Rebbe went out of jail, it was a Tuesday, and the Alter Rebbe writes in a letter. We have a chance on Yutas Kislev, we'll learn the letter. When he went out of jail, he sent the letter to 3. One letter was to his closest friend, Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchuk. The second letter was to Rabbi Baruch of Mezhebush, where he's the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And the third letter was to all the Chassidim. And in the letter, he writes that he went out of jail on the day of the yahrzeit of the Mazur Shemani, Yutas Kislev. And he was saying to him, and he was saying the pasuk in chapter 55. And as he began saying the pasuk, Pada b'shalom nafshi, Hashem, you redeemed me in peace. Before he finished, they came to inform him that he's free. And he went out. But the release from jail wasn't complete because after that, he went into the house of this person. Now, this part of the story, I'm not sure if it happened. You know, the Alter Rebbe was, after this, was arrested 2 years later again. And again, he was in jail. And again, he went out of jail in Kislev, but in Hanukkah time. So I'm not sure if this happened the first time or the second time. But some say it happened the first time. That when he was in the house of this person, he asked the Alter Rebbe to promise him that he's going to meet with 3 people who are the greatest sort of giants in the non-Hasidic world, and he should present to them why he's spreading Chassidus. Hoping that through that, maybe they'll be able to convince the Alter Rebbe to stop doing what he's doing. And the Alter Rebbe gave him a handshake, which was a commitment that I'm going to do it. So the Alter Rebbe visited 3 people. I remember the stories of 2, and I remember what happened with the 3rd. One of them was someone was called Rabbi Yeshua Zeitlin, Zeitlish. And he was, first of all, a Goyen. He was a giant in Torah, but he was also a community activist. He was a person very involved with the community, with the government, and he was a tremendous influential person. And therefore, he wanted him to meet with the Alter Rebbe. So he wanted to see, before we even get started, with Alter Rebbe is really a tzaddik, the way they say. Because there's a passage that says, La Ye'una le'tzaddik kol oven, that a tzaddik, Hashem will protect him from doing an Aveira. So he had a plan. He planned something to make the Alter Rebbe do an Aveira, and he see if the Eibush is going to protect him or not. What did he do? When a person comes into your house, you put something down on the table, fruits, vegetables, something to drink. So when the Alter Rebbe came, he asked his worker to bring wine. In those days, there were people who worked in Jewish homes that they worked there so long, so many years of their life, they were fluent in Yiddish like any other Jewish child that grew up with Yiddish. Fluent Yiddish. And he wasn't Jewish, but he spoke Yiddish fluently. And actually, when a non-Jew touches wine, it becomes treif. So he told this worker in front of the Alter Rebbe in Yiddish, could you go downstairs to the basement and get some wine? And he went and brought wine. I was going to see whether the Alter Rebbe will sense that there's something wrong with the wine or not. Now, I just have to say that his intention was not chas v'sholom to have the Alter Rebbe drink not kosher wine, that's an Avera. It's one of the 365 negative commandments. You're not allowed to do something to make another person violate Torah. His intention was to see if he's about to drink it, he'll stop him. That was his plan. So he poured the Alter Rebbe a cup of wine, and as soon as the Alter Rebbe takes a cup of wine, he's getting ready to drink him, starts making a bracha. And of course, as it says the word Baruch, he was going to stop him before he pronounced Hashem's name. But what happened was when the Alter Rebbe started to make the bracha, his face changed. His face started to radiate like he never in his life saw a person make such a bracha. And he got so distracted that he forgot to tell him to stop. And he made the bracha. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, shehakol li b'dvarim. He gave him wine. And he said, shehakol li b'dvarim, drank it. And he said, by the way, this is not wine, it's honey wine. Honey wine is not real wine, it's a shehakol. And now it's a shaila on all the wine in your basement. In other words, he detected that it was not a Jew, and therefore the wine in the basement is now in question. But the wine in the cup wasn't wine, it was a different kind of drink. It's called wine, but it's really honey wine. And therefore he made a bracha shehakol. So that was the first Shalom Aleichem that he saw that this is not an ordinary person. And then when they walked out, he actually publicized his opinion that Alter Rebbe is a brilliant Torah scholar and he's a tzaddik, and all the accusations against him are false, and so on. The other person was a person also that was a very, very big Torah scholar. He was one of the most biggest Torah scholars in the whole area. He knew Gemara and Torah books by heart, inside out. And you can see just from this little detail, he was a person that he was so big, he didn't really respect almost anybody because nobody came close to him. When the Alter Rebbe walked in, he hardly even looked at him. And then he said to him, tell me, how many times does it say Abaye and Rabbi in the entire Shas? I have to explain what that means. The Shas is thousands of papers. If you ask a question like that, if you put it into a computer, it probably could answer you in a second. How many times? But this is not a computer. And he asked him, how many times does it say Rav and Abaye in the whole Shas? Why these two names? They're so common in Gemara, these two rabbis, that you can hardly, I think they say you can't turn more than 3 pages without coming across these two names. So therefore, how many times? And Dr. Rebbe gave a number. He said, no, you're wrong, you're off by 1 number, right? And Dr. Rebbe showed him, this is the way he spelled Rabba. Abaye spelled Aleph, Beis, Yud, Yud, Abaye. And they say that stands for Honor, B'choyach, and Hashem. Rabba spelled Reish, Beis, Aleph. There's another one of the sages, which is actually mentioned in Tanya, whose name was Rabba. It looks the same, but it's different. This is Reish, Beis, Hey. Not Aleph, but Hey. So he said, the reason why your number is more than mine, because in this place, it's actually a Hey, not an Aleph, so it's not Rabba. And he said, no, it is. But we're talking about brilliant minds that know how to say in a moment how many times this word is found in the entire Shas. The only thing I can think of that can do that is a computer, and also a good computer. So when Alter Rebbe walked out of his place, of course, he spoke to him mainly about Gemara and Torah subjects. He was blown away by the Alter Rebbe's knowledge of Torah, and then he himself brought the Alter Rebbe a chair, and then he walked the Alter Rebbe out, and he also came out with the same conclusion. The Alter Rebbe is a brilliant Torah scholar and is a tzaddik, and all the accusations against him are false. And the same thing happened with the third. So the truth is that after the Alter Rebbe went out of jail, just the going out of jail and this, it brought much more people closer to Chassidus. First of all, even people that oppose the Alter Rebbe would never think of such a thing to inform the government that they should, God forbid, execute the Alter Rebbe. Nobody would have done that. So that alone caused a lot of people to back off, to see that they're going too far. But especially after this, it led to more people accepting the Alter Rebbe, accepting Chassidus. So let me see if we have 10 minutes to explain a little bit what was the controversy in the heavenly court? Yes, Chassidus, no Chassidus, too much Chassidus. What is it about? So I want to start with this story. And next week in the schedule, we're going to learn a sikha that explains this much more. But I'll just bring the general idea. Hopefully that'll help you understand the sikha better. The Mezritch Maggid had a student who was a student, but also a colleague, because they were both students of the Baal Shem Tov. Very big tzaddik, his name is Pinchas Koritzer. So even though he was a student of the Maggid and respected the Maggid, but he was also against the Maggid, he felt, he was a chassid, naturally. He was a chassidic rebbe, but he still felt that the Maggid was spreading chassidus more than the Baal Shem Tov, going out too much. And it was especially against putting chassidus in writing, again, because that makes it more accessible to people. So one time, the Mezritch Maggid walked over to the Alter Rebbe and said, I want to say thank you, you saved my life. And then he told him this story. Why did he save his life? But Pinchas Koritzer came to Mezritch, and as I said, he was against putting chassidus in writing. Take a look on the floor. There's a piece of paper that has Hasidic writing on it, and it's sort of in the garbage. And he was beside himself. That there's such a disgrace, and there's such a degradation for something so holy to be in such a place, and he was always against it. And he started to think that this is why I'm always against what the Maggid does. The Alter Rebbe was standing there, and he saw what was happening. So he said to the Pinchas Koritzer, can I explain it with a mashal? You have to understand that the Alter Rebbe was much younger than him, but nevertheless he listened to the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe's mashal calmed him down. What was the mashal? So the mashal is like this. There was once a king, a very powerful king, that he had a one and only son. And he wanted the one and only son should be more developed in everything. So he sent him to a very far place, to an island somewhere. And he said to go to these places, these islands, he'll learn more about the nature in plants, the nature of different animals. He'll learn about the nature of different people, how to hunt different kinds of animals. Just learn about life, not by sitting in the palace all day. And through that, it'll develop his talents. One day, news came to the king that his son became very sick, and that all the doctors that are there have no cure for him. So the Melech, the king, immediately made it be known in the whole kingdom that whoever knows of a cure for this disease should come to the palace immediately. And all sorts of doctors and healers came, but nobody had a cure for the disease. There was one person that came, and he says that he knows something that could be done. He's very knowledgeable with diamonds, gems, different precious stones. And he says there's a certain stone, it's a rare gem, but this gem has in it a certain property that if you would grind it and turn it into liquid and pour that together with wine or some other liquid, and the child would drink it, this would restore his health. This and only this, nothing else could help. So the Melech immediately called his experts on diamonds and gems and told him to look through the king's treasures and find such a diamond, not to waste a moment. They searched and searched and searched, went through everything, they couldn't find this diamond. And then they found the diamond. Good news and bad news. The good news was that they found the diamond. The bad news was that this diamond was the crown jewel of the king. Kings wore a crown. The crown had brilliant diamonds, gems that made it beautiful. But there was always one diamond, which is called the crown jewel. Like this is the most magnificent, beautiful, gave the whole beauty to the crown. And that's where it is. So surely the king would not allow to take that and grind it, because that would ruin the beauty of the crown. And the king is the crown is the king. But when the king heard that it's on his crown, he said they should immediately take it and do that exactly what he said, grind it, make it into liquid, mix it with some wine, and to give it to the son. So they were pretty shocked that the king said to do that. But then they told the king, wait a second, there's a new problem. He's so sick now, he can't even open his mouth to drink. So there's no point. This could have been done a few weeks ago, but not anymore. So the king said, nevertheless, do it, take it, pour it on his mouth. Maybe a drop will get in, and that drop will restore his health. And it's worth it. So they asked the king why. I mean, a few weeks ago when he was able to drink, we can understand. But now, how are you allowing to take the crown jewel and destroy it when you don't even know if it's going to help? And the king's answer was that if it doesn't help, what do I need the crown for? What do I need the jewel for? I want my child to be alive. And therefore, I'm ready to grind it, which means this jewel is not going to be where it's supposed to be in the crown. But if this is going to save the life of the child, it's all worth it. And the Alter Rebbe gave this mashal, which meant that we're living in a time now that the child, meaning the Yidden, needs something very strong to restore their spiritual health. And the crown jewel are the deep secrets of Torah. And Hashem is ready to give all that up to save the life of the child. When he heard this mashal, he calmed down and he said, yes, you're right. And the Mezritch Maggid said that when he, in his head, was thinking negatively about the Maggid, he created prosecuting angels in heaven against the Maggid, to the point that they were going to take away his life. Because he's revealing, imagine somebody would walk over to a king physically and do that. Walk over to the king, grab the crown, take the jewel and grind it. That's it. He would be a goner. How could you do such a thing? So in a sense, spiritually, that's what he did. He took the crown jewel of Hashem, the deepest secrets of Torah, to grind it, and therefore there was a kitrug against it. What was the justification? But through this, the child will be able to be restored his health. He'll be alive, so it's worth it. That's the mashal. Now the question is, what's the nimshal? Why? What does it mean in the nimshal that the child is in such a state? And what does it mean in the nimshal that you need the deep secrets of Torah? Why the deep secrets? Or why not Torah in general? So the answer is, we don't have enough time. I don't know how are you going to survive? So there's two questions. And in fact, this was the main reason why there was so much opposition against Chassidus. The reason why there was opposition, because this was never done before. I'm not talking about in heaven, down here. The difference between Yutas Kislev and other sort of crises that happened in the Jewish community was, this was not just people like conservative, reform, fighting Orthodox. These were the greatest rabbis, Torah scholars, leaders of Jewry that were fighting the Baal Shem Tov. And they were fighting it from, of course, there were people, like I said last time, that distorted things, they were lying, but most of it were great rabbis, great people. Even the Maggid Mezritch himself, could you imagine? The Maggid Mezritch himself was one of the people that opposed the Baal Shem Tov before he became a chassid. So the opposition came from great people. So what was the main thing? Because they said for generations, for centuries, this part of Torah was hidden. How are you making changes that now it's different? Obviously, the answer of Baal Shem Tov was, you're right. But then was one situation, but now is a new situation, and it has to be revealed. And this mashal is supposed to help explain that. So we need to explain these two things in the mashal. What does it mean, and why is it that at that point the child was so sick? And the second question is, why does it have to be the hidden secrets of Torah? Why can't it be just Torah in general? That's going to restore the life of a Yid. After all, Torah is life. Torah is Hashem's Torah. Should do the same. So Bli Neder, Monday we'll go into this. It's a shame. Okay.